My father-in-law told my wife to leave me because I wasn't father material and couldn't give her the lifestyle she deserved. When I confronted him, he smirked and said, "Some men just aren't enough, son. You're one of them." I stayed silent. That was 9 months ago. This morning, he was standing outside my wife's work in handcuffs. My father-in-law told my wife to leave me, so I told her about the secret second family he's been hiding for years. Now he's the one cut off, and the family's in shambles. From the very start of my marriage, my father-in-law, Tom, made it clear that he didn't like me. And I'm not talking about the dad being protective of his daughter type of cold shoulder. I mean open, deliberate hostility. He never used my name. He'd call me the boy or that guy, even though I was in my 30s when my wife and I got married. When I came to family dinners, he would purposely leave an empty seat between me and my wife, sometimes even sitting between us. At one Thanksgiving, I tried to help clear the table, and he told me, "Men don't belong in the kitchen unless you're hungry." He then shoved the dirty plates back into my hands and told me to prove I'm good for something by washing them. He was also the type to make jokes that weren't really jokes. When I got a promotion at work, instead of congratulating me, he smirked and said, "Wow, must be nice to be rewarded for doing the bare minimum." When my wife and I bought our first house, he told everyone at a family BBQ that we must have gotten it through her credit score, completely ignoring the fact that I paid most of the down payment. It didn't stop there. He'd constantly undermine me in front of my wife. If I made a suggestion about home repairs, vacation plans, even what brand of dog food to get, he would tell her, "Sweetheart, don't just take his word for it. Check with someone who knows what they're talking about." And he'd say it like I wasn't even in the room. At first, I tried to ignore it for my wife's sake. She's very close to her family, and I didn't want to make her choose sides over petty remarks. But over the years, it wore me down. Then came the breaking point. A couple of months ago, my wife went to her parents' house to help her mom with something, and when she came home, she was unusually quiet. Later that night, she told me that her dad had sat her down privately and told her she deserves better than me. He listed off every single thing he thought was wrong with me, that I wasn't ambitious enough, that I wasn't providing her the lifestyle she could have had if she married someone else, and that he thought I wasn't father material because we hadn't had kids yet, even though we were waiting until we were financially ready. Then he told her, point blank, that she should leave me now before it's too late. That was it for me. I'd taken years of his insults, his disrespect, his attempts to make me look small in front of her, but actively trying to end our marriage crossed the line. See, I've known something about Tom for a long time, something I never wanted to use because I knew it would nuke the family dynamic. About 5 years ago, when my wife and I were still dating, I ran into Tom at a restaurant. He wasn't with my mother-in-law. He was with another woman and 2 teenage kids. He didn't see me, but the way those kids called him Dad was unmistakable. I didn't say anything at the time because I figured it wasn't my business. I didn't even tell my wife because I knew it would destroy her. But after he tried to destroy us, the gloves came off. The next day, I told my wife everything. I told her about the restaurant, the other woman, the kids. I told her I hadn't mentioned it before because I didn't want to hurt her, but now I couldn't stand by while he pretended to be some moral authority over our marriage. At first, she didn't believe me. She said there had to be some mistake, but I could see the doubt start to creep in. She called her dad that night and confronted him. He didn't even deny it. Apparently, my mother-in-law has known for years, but agreed to keep quiet for the sake of keeping the family together. My wife was furious, not just at him, but at everyone who helped cover it up. Now, everything is chaos. My wife hasn't spoken to her father since that night. My mother-in-law is livid with me for throwing it in her face and ruining their family. My wife's siblings are split. Half think Tom brought it on himself, half think I'm the villain for using the secret to get back at him. Last night, things got even worse. My wife went to her parents' house to grab some things, and I guess the tension boiled over. She called me an hour later, her voice shaking, and said they'd been screaming at each other. Then, in the middle of the argument, Tom snapped, "You're not even mine to begin with," he yelled. Sarah's voice cracked when she called me from her car outside their house, barely able to get the words out between sobs. I could hear her breathing hard and told her to drive home right now, that I'd be waiting for her. She kept repeating what Tom had said over and over, like she couldn't believe the words had actually come out of his mouth. When she pulled into our driveway at 11, I was already at the door, and she practically fell into my arms, her whole body shaking. Her face was red and puffy from crying, and she kept grabbing my shirt like she needed something solid to hold on to. We sat on the couch, and she tried to make sense of it, asking me if her whole life had been some kind of lie, if anything about who she thought she was could be real. Around midnight, she grabbed her phone and called Marcus, putting him on speaker so I could hear too. Marcus went quiet for a long moment when she told him what Tom had said. Then his voice got hard, and he said he was driving over to their parents' house right now to get answers. While Marcus was on his way there, Sarah pulled out the old photo albums from the hallway closet and started flipping through them frantically. She pointed at picture after picture, showing me how she had her mom's nose but nothing that looked like Tom, how her hair was lighter than everyone else's in the family. I kept telling her that lots of kids don't look exactly like their parents, that it didn't have to mean anything, but I could see she wasn't really listening. We waited for Marcus to call back, Sarah pacing around the living room and checking her phone every few seconds. At 2:30 in the morning, Marcus finally called, and his voice sounded exhausted. He said Linda was sobbing so hard she couldn't even talk straight and wouldn't give him a real answer about Sarah's paternity. Tom had locked himself in his study and wouldn't come out or say anything else about what he'd meant. Marcus said the house was like a war zone with things thrown around, and Linda just sitting on the kitchen floor crying. The next morning, Sarah sat at the kitchen table staring at her phone, but couldn't touch the toast I made her. She kept waiting for someone to call and tell her the truth about who she really was, and I made her tea instead, while canceling our plans to visit my parents that weekend. Around 10, Jessica texted Sarah saying their mom wanted to meet with just Sarah alone, no spouses and no Marcus. harass. Sarah stared at the message for a long time, torn between needing to know the truth and not being able to trust Linda anymore after everything. After going back and forth for an hour, she finally agreed to meet at the coffee shop downtown. When Sarah came back from meeting Linda, she looked completely destroyed. She sat down at our kitchen table and told me Linda had admitted everything, that Sarah's biological father was someone Linda had been with briefly before she married Tom. Tom had known from the very beginning, but had agreed to raise Sarah as his own daughter, right up until he threw it in her face as a weapon last night. Sarah called Marcus and Jessica to come over for an emergency meeting, and when they got to our house, she told them what Linda had confessed. Jessica started crying immediately and said it all made sense now, why Tom had always treated Sarah differently, why he'd been harder on her than the rest of them. Marcus was furious and kept saying they'd all been living this lie their whole lives, that their entire family had been built on deception. That evening after her siblings left, Sarah asked me quietly if this changed how I saw her. I pulled her close and told her she was exactly who she'd always been, the woman I fell in love with and married. She looked at me with tears in her eyes and said I was the only family she could really trust now. The next few days passed in a blur of anger and confusion for everyone. Sarah kept checking her phone every few minutes, waiting for something from her mom. Finally, on Thursday morning, she got a text from Linda. It was short and cold, just saying she had information about Sarah's real father if she wanted it. Sarah's hands shook as she showed me the message. Within minutes, Linda sent another text with a name, Robert Smith, and claimed he died in a car accident when Sarah was 3 years old. She said she had old photos and letters in a box somewhere if Sarah wanted them. Sarah stared at the phone for a long time before deciding to search for Robert Smith online. She typed the name into Facebook and started scrolling through profiles. After about an hour of searching different variations and checking old yearbook sites, she found something strange. There was a Robert Johnson, not Smith, who looked exactly like the man in one of her baby photos. He lived in Cleveland, just 2 hours away, and his profile showed him with a wife and 3 kids. Sarah's face went white as she clicked through his photos. She found one from a family reunion where he was standing next to an older woman who looked just like Sarah's grandmother. The caption said something about visiting his mother for her birthday. Sarah took screenshots of everything and immediately sent them to Marcus and Jessica in their group chat. Marcus called within seconds, yelling that Linda had been lying about this too. Jessica stayed quiet, but finally texted back that she wasn't surprised anymore. The next morning, Sarah confronted Linda through text messages about Robert being alive. Something feels off about Tom keeping this paternity secret for decades, only to throw it out during a simple argument. The timing seems too convenient, like he was waiting for the perfect moment to hurt Sarah the most, which makes me wonder what else he's been calculating all these years. Linda read the messages but didn't respond for hours. Sarah kept sending more texts, getting angrier with each one. Finally, Linda wrote back claiming Sarah was mistaken and that she should leave the past alone. When Sarah sent her the screenshots, Linda stopped responding completely. 3 hours later, she finally admitted she'd lied to protect everyone from more pain. Sarah decided right then that she needed to contact Robert directly. She sat at our kitchen table with her laptop, starting and deleting email drafts over and over. I sat next to her, helping her find the right words to explain who she was. We worked on it for 4 hours, trying to figure out how to tell someone they might have a daughter they never knew about. Sarah would type a sentence, then delete it and start over. She kept asking me if she sounded crazy or desperate. I told her she sounded like someone who deserved the truth. Finally, she had a simple message introducing herself and asking if they could talk. Just as she was about to hit send, Marcus called with news that made everything else seem small. He'd been going through Tom's business records that he'd found online and discovered something huge. Tom had been sending Elena Rodriguez $3,000 every month for the past 15 years. The payments were listed as consulting fees from his construction company. Marcus had screenshots of bank statements showing the transfers going back years. This wasn't just some affair or mistake. This was Tom living a complete double life. Sarah put Robert's email on hold while we processed this new information. An hour later, Jessica showed up at our door looking upset and confused. She said Tom had called her that morning, trying to turn her against Sarah and me. She'd recorded the whole conversation on her phone. In the recording, Tom admitted he'd been supporting Elena's kids because they needed a father figure. He kept saying we were destroying the family for revenge and that Linda knew what she was doing all along. Jessica played the recording twice so we could hear every word. Tom sounded desperate and angry, nothing like the confident man who'd insulted me for years. That evening, Sarah's phone buzzed with a Facebook message from Elena Rodriguez herself. Elena wrote that she was tired of being hidden and wanted to meet Sarah face to face. She claimed Tom had promised to leave Linda 5 years ago but never followed through. She said she had proof of all his promises if Sarah wanted to see them. Sarah showed me the message and we both knew she had to meet this woman. 3 days later, Sarah, Marcus, and I drove to a restaurant halfway between our house and Elena's. Elena was already there when we arrived, sitting at a corner booth with a manila folder in front of her. She was younger than Linda, maybe early 40s, with 2 teenagers sitting beside her. The boy looked about 17 and kept his head down the whole time. The girl, who Elena introduced as Sophia, was 14 and looked exactly like Jessica at that age. Elena opened the folder and spread out dozens of photos across the table. There were pictures of Tom at Disney World with Elena and the kids, pictures of him at the boys' baseball games and the girls' dance recitals. Every photo was from a time when Tom had told Linda he was away on business trips. The kids called him Dad like it was the most natural thing in the world. Elena explained that Tom had told them their parents were separated because of work complications. She pulled out her phone and showed us years of text messages from Tom. In them, he promised over and over that he'd marry her once the paperwork was finalized. He told her Linda was his difficult difficult ex-wife who refused to sign the divorce papers. Elena had believed him completely and had no idea Linda still thought they were married. The kids sat there in shock as they learned their whole life was built on lies. Back at our house that night, Sarah sat on the couch in complete silence. She stared at the wall for almost an hour before finally speaking. She wondered out loud how many school plays Tom had missed to be with his other family, how many birthdays and holidays he'd spent with Elena's kids instead of with them. She asked me if I thought he ever felt guilty about lying to everyone. I didn't have an answer that would make any of it better. The next morning, Marcus showed up at our door with his laptop and a flash drive, saying we needed to organize everything before Tom tried to spin this his way. He'd already started making a shared folder with all the photos Elena had sent, the financial records he'd found showing Tom's payments to her over the years, and screenshots of text messages between them that Elena had forwarded to Sarah. Marcus kept saying we had to protect their mom's assets, because if Tom divorced her for Elena, she could lose half of everything she'd worked for her whole life. Sarah just nodded and helped him scan old bank statements, but I could see her hands shaking as she typed. 3 days later, we were eating dinner when we heard a car screech into our driveway, and Linda started pounding on our front door like she was trying to break it down. When I opened it, she pushed past me without even looking at me and went straight for Sarah, grabbing her shoulders and begging her not to contact Robert. She finally admitted she'd known about Elena for 8 years, but stayed because she thought it was better for the kids to have their father around, even if he was splitting his time. She kept saying meeting Robert would ruin everything, that some secrets were meant to stay buried, that Sarah had a good life without him. Sarah pulled away from her and told her everything was already ruined the moment Tom decided to have 2 families. Linda left crying, and Sarah spent the rest of the night staring at Robert's contact information on her phone. A week later, she finally hit send on the email she'd written and rewritten a dozen times. Within 4 hours, Robert had written back, and his response made Sarah cry harder than I'd seen since this whole thing started. He said Linda had told him she lost the baby, that she'd miscarried and needed space to heal, and then she'd just disappeared from his life completely. He never knew Sarah existed, never knew he had a daughter out there, and he was shocked but so happy to finally know the truth. The next day, Sarah showed me his response on her phone, and he'd included a photo of himself with his wife and 2 teenage boys at what looked like a baseball game. Sarah had his exact same eyes and that crooked smile that always came out when she was really happy about something. She kept zooming in on the photo, pointing out how her nose was shaped just like his, how they both had the same widow's peak, how even their hands looked similar. She cried again, but this time it wasn't all sadness. She said she finally understood where parts of herself came from. That Friday morning, my phone started blowing up with messages from Sarah's cousins, aunts, uncles, even some family friends I'd only met once or twice. Tom had sent a group text to what looked like 50 people, claiming I was manipulating Sarah with lies about him, that I'd threatened to destroy the family if they didn't accept me, that I was the one tearing everyone apart because I couldn't handle being seen as not good enough. He wrote that I'd been plotting this for years, collecting fake evidence, turning Sarah against her real family, and now I was trying to steal their mother's money by making up stories about affairs. Sarah's phone was going off too, and she just sat there reading message after message from family members, asking if it was true, if I was really doing this to them. Sunday came, and Sarah insisted on going to church like normal, saying she wasn't going to let Tom control where she could and couldn't go. But the second we pulled into the parking lot, her Aunt Margaret was waiting by our car with 2 other relatives I recognized from holiday dinners. They surrounded Sarah before she could even close her door, telling her how disappointed they were that she was airing family business, that some things should stay private, that she was being selfish and hurting everyone with these accusations. Sarah realized then that Tom had been calling everyone for days, telling his version first, making sure they'd already picked sides before they heard the truth. Her cousin Beth actually said Sarah should be grateful Tom raised her, even though she wasn't really his, like that somehow made everything else okay. Monday morning, Marcus drove straight to Tom's office with a folder full of printed bank statements, photos, and text messages. He told me later that Tom's secretary tried to stop him, but he walked right past her into Tom's office and dropped everything on his desk. Tom threatened to call security. Then when he saw what Marcus had, he switched to threatening to sue him for corporate espionage, saying he'd stolen private financial information. Marcus had his phone recording in his pocket when Tom said those kids with Elena deserved support because they were planned and wanted, unlike Sarah, who was forced on him by Linda's lies. Marcus left before security arrived, but he had what he needed. Tom admitting on tape that he'd never wanted Sarah, that he saw her as a burden he'd been tricked into raising. Tuesday at work, Sarah couldn't focus on anything, and her supervisor Karen pulled her aside after Sarah sent the same email 3 times with different information each time. Karen asked if everything was okay at home, if Sarah needed some time off, but Sarah just said she was fine and went back to her desk. At lunch, she sat in her car in the parking lot, scrolling through the photos Robert had sent, looking at his sons who would have been her brothers if things had been different. She later told me she spent 20 minutes just staring at a photo of Robert at what looked like his wedding, wondering if he would have wanted her there, if she could have been part of that family instead. Tom's playing chess while everyone else is playing checkers, except his strategy involves maintaining 2 families and hoping nobody compares notes. The man managed monthly payments for 15 years, but couldn't manage basic honesty for 15 minutes. Wednesday evening, Sarah's phone rang, and it was Jessica, crying so hard she could barely talk. Tom had shown up at her apartment an hour earlier, trying to convince her that Sarah wasn't really her full sister, that she should be loyal to the real family, the ones who shared actual blood with her. Jessica had told him to leave, but he'd stood in her doorway for 10 minutes, listing all the things he'd done for Sarah over the years, how ungrateful she was being, how Jessica needed to choose the right side before it was too late. Jessica was shaking when she called us, saying she'd never seen Tom like that, desperate and mean, and trying to turn her against her own sister. Thursday night, 2 weeks since Tom's big revelation about Sarah not being his, Elena sent Sarah a text that changed everything again. Tom had been calling Elena nonstop for days, demanding she stay quiet, threatening to cut off all support for Daniel and Sophia if she said anything to anyone. But Elena was done being his secret, done lying to her kids about why their dad could only visit certain days, done pretending their family situation was normal. She'd decided to tell Daniel and Sophia the truth about their father's other family, and she wanted Sarah there when she did it, saying maybe if the kids all met each other, they could at least have some relationship, even if their parents had messed everything up. The drive to Cleveland took 3 hours, and Sarah spent most of it staring out the window while I kept checking the rearview mirror. Elena's house sat on a quiet street with old maple trees and kids' bikes left on front lawns. We pulled into her driveway behind a beat-up minivan with soccer stickers on the back window. Elena opened the door before we even knocked, and her face looked tired but determined. Inside, 2 teenagers sat on a worn couch watching TV, and they both turned to look at us. Daniel looked just like Tom, with the same square jaw and dark eyes. Sophia had Elena's softer features but Tom's stubborn chin. Elena asked them to turn off the TV and sit at the dining room table. She pulled out a manila folder thick with papers and photos. Sarah sat next to me and grabbed my hand under the table. Elena started talking in a flat voice about how their dad had another family he'd been hiding for 20 years. She showed them a photo of Tom with Linda and Marcus and Sarah at some fancy restaurant. Daniel's face went red, and he kept shaking his head like he could make it not true. Sophia started crying and asking if this meant their parents were getting divorced. Elena had to explain they were never actually married, because Tom was already married to Linda. That's when Daniel jumped up and knocked his chair over. He yelled something about this being bullshit and slammed out the front door so hard the windows rattled. Sophia ran upstairs sobbing, and we could hear her bedroom door slam. Elena just sat there staring at the photos spread across the table. About an hour later, Daniel came back with grass stains on his jeans and red eyes. He pulled out his phone and showed us message after message from Tom. The text said Elena was confused and making things up because she was angry about money. Tom kept telling Daniel not to believe anything his mom said until they could talk in person. Daniel looked straight at Sarah and asked if his dad was really a liar. Sarah nodded and said yes in a quiet voice. Daniel threw his phone against the wall and it shattered into pieces. Elena got up and started making coffee like it was just another normal afternoon. While the coffee brewed, she told us Tom had bought this house but put it in her name for tax reasons. She'd been keeping receipts and bank statements for years because something always felt wrong. She never imagined he had a whole other family, but she knew something wasn't right. Elena pulled out a small brass key from a kitchen drawer. She said Tom gave it to her years ago for emergencies, and it opened a safety deposit box at the bank downtown. Inside were documents about trust funds he'd set up for Daniel and Sophia using money from his business with Linda. She'd gone to look at them last week and discovered the funds were funded with money that should have gone to Linda's business account. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus saying to call him immediately. When I called back, his voice was shaky, and he said Linda was at the hospital with chest pains. The stress had triggered a panic attack so severe the paramedics thought it was a heart attack. Tom was there playing the perfect husband and telling all the nurses how worried he was. Marcus said we needed to get there fast because Tom was already spinning stories. The drive to the hospital felt like forever, even though it was only 20 minutes. Sarah refused to go into the waiting room where Tom was sitting. Marcus met us in the hallway and said Tom had been telling the nurses that Sarah had mental health issues. He'd told them she was unstable and shouldn't be allowed to see Linda without supervision. Security had already been notified to watch for any family disturbances. A hospital social worker in a navy blazer pulled Sarah aside near the vending machines. She said Mr. Thompson had raised concerns about Sarah's mental stability and potential for violence. Sarah pulled out her phone and played the recorded calls where Tom threatened her. She showed the texts where he called her worthless and said she wasn't really his daughter. The social worker's expression changed from professional concern to something like disgust. She said she would note the family dynamics in her report and make sure the medical team understood the situation. 3 weeks passed in a blur of lawyers and paperwork and family meetings that ended in screaming matches. Robert had been calling Sarah every few days just to check in and finally asked to meet in person. They picked a park pavilion halfway between Cleveland and our town on a gray Tuesday afternoon. Robert showed up with a cardboard box full of old photo albums from college. He had pictures of Linda from when they dated, and she looked so young and happy. Robert said they met in an economics class and dated for 2 years before she suddenly cut off all contact. He'd tried calling and writing letters, but she never responded, and eventually he gave up. Now he understood it was right when she met Tom, who was already successful with his own business. Tom was everything Robert wasn't back then, since Robert was just a broke college student working 2 jobs. Robert's hands shook as he told Sarah about hiring a private investigator 5 years ago. His mother had just died, and he wanted closure about what happened with Linda all those years ago. The investigator reported back that Linda was happily married with 3 children living in the suburbs. Robert never pursued it further because he didn't want to disrupt her life. He had no idea one of those 3 children was actually his daughter. Sarah called Marcus that same day, and they made an appointment with a family lawyer downtown for the following week. The lawyer's office was on the 10th floor of this old building with creaky elevators and worn carpet in the hallways. Marcus brought 3 boxes of documents he'd been collecting, bank statements and property records and tax returns going back 15 years. The lawyer, this older woman with reading glasses on a chain, spread everything everything across her conference table and started marking things with sticky notes. She kept shaking her head as she went through the papers, making notes on a yellow legal pad. After 2 hours, she looked up at us and said Tom had been committing financial fraud for years. She showed us how he'd been moving money around, hiding assets, setting up shell companies to funnel cash away from Linda. We could freeze his accounts and protect Linda's interests, but it would mean going to court and things would get ugly fast. Then she found something that made her stop cold. Tom had been transferring ownership of family properties into a trust over the past 3 years. The trust documents showed only 2 beneficiaries, Tom and Elena Rodriguez. He'd been systematically removing Linda's name from deeds and titles, replacing her with his other woman. The house Linda lived in wasn't even in her name anymore. The vacation cabin her parents left her had been transferred 6 months ago. Even their joint investment accounts had been drained and moved to accounts Linda couldn't access. Marcus grabbed the documents and his face went white as he read through them. This wasn't just hiding money. Tom had been planning to leave Linda with absolutely nothing while keeping his reputation intact. Sarah started crying right there in the lawyer's office. Not sad tears, but angry ones. The next day, she drove to her aunt's house, Linda's sister, who lived about an hour away. Her aunt made coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table while Sarah explained everything that was happening. That's when her aunt revealed something Linda had told her years ago in confidence. Tom had threatened Linda when Sarah was about 5 years old, said if she ever exposed his affair, he'd take the kids away. He told her no court would give custody to a mother who lied about her child's paternity for years. Linda had been trapped, keeping quiet to protect her children while Tom built his second life with Elena. A month passed before Sarah felt ready to try therapy with me. We found someone who specialized in family trauma and made our first appointment on a Tuesday afternoon. The therapist's office had these soft chairs and boxes of tissues on every surface. Sarah spent most of that first session talking about how 3 different parents had been lying to her for her entire life. The therapist kept nodding and telling her that her anger was completely valid, that anyone would feel betrayed in her situation. I mostly sat there holding Sarah's hand while she worked through everything out loud. Elena's timing here is interesting. Suddenly she's done with secrets right when Tom's world is falling apart. The way she kept all those receipts and bank statements for years tells me she knew something was wrong, but stayed anyway. 2 days after that session, Sarah got a message on Instagram from someone named Daniel Rodriguez. The profile picture showed a teenage boy who looked exactly like Tom around the eyes. Daniel said he needed to understand what was happening because his dad wasn't telling him anything. Sarah agreed to meet him at a coffee shop near the mall the following Saturday. Daniel showed up wearing a hoodie and looking nervous, kept checking his phone like he was worried about getting caught. Sarah carefully explained the situation, how Tom had been lying to both families for years. Daniel listened without interrupting, then mentioned that Tom had been promising him a new car if he stayed loyal and didn't talk to anyone from Linda's side of the family. The kid looked confused and hurt, caught between the dad he'd known his whole life and the truth that was finally coming out. 3 weeks later, I was leaving work around 7 when Tom appeared in the parking garage. He must have been waiting by my car because he stepped out from behind a concrete pillar as I approached. Before I could react, he grabbed my shirt and pushed me against my car door. He got right in my face and said he would destroy me professionally if I didn't get Sarah to back off. I managed to pull my phone from my pocket and started recording without him noticing. He kept threatening me, saying he had connections everywhere and could make sure I never worked in this town again. His grip tightened on my shirt, and for a second I thought he might actually hit me. Then someone else entered the garage and Tom let go, straightening his tie like nothing happened. He walked away, but not before warning me this wasn't over. I drove straight to the police station with the video still on my phone. The officer at the desk barely looked up when I explained what happened. He called it family drama and said these things usually work themselves out. I insisted on filing a report and requesting a restraining order against Tom. The officer sighed and pulled out the forms, typing slowly with 2 fingers while I gave my statement. An hour later, while I was still at the station, Sarah got a text from Tom saying I was escalating things unnecessarily and she needed to control her husband. She screenshot it and forwarded it to the lawyer as more evidence of his harassment. Jessica came by our apartment the next evening looking exhausted. She collapsed on our couch and said the extended family was tearing itself apart over this whole situation. Tom's siblings were sending her nasty messages about betraying family values and choosing sides. Some cousins she'd been close to her whole life weren't speaking to her anymore. She showed us her phone with dozens of angry texts and said she was thinking about changing her number just to get some peace. While all this was happening, Marcus had been digging deeper into Tom's business records. He discovered something that made everything else look minor in comparison. Tom had been using his construction business to launder money for Elena's family for years. Every expense for Elena's household got written off as a business cost. Her mortgage payments were listed as office rent. Her kids' private school tuition showed up as employee training expenses. Their family vacations were logged as business trips and client meetings. This wasn't just fraud against Linda anymore. This was federal tax evasion on a massive scale. Marcus gathered all the evidence and made copies of everything before anyone could make it disappear. 6 weeks after everything started falling apart, an official-looking envelope arrived at Tom and Linda's house. Linda called Marcus immediately when she saw it was from the IRS. The letter said Tom's business was being audited due to irregularities in his tax filings going back 5 years. They wanted to see all financial records, receipts, and documentation for every claimed business expense. Tom didn't know yet that Marcus had reported him to the IRS with a thick folder of evidence 3 weeks earlier. The next morning, Elena called Sarah's phone while we were having breakfast, and I could hear the panic in her voice even from across the table. She was crying and talking so fast that Sarah had to ask her to slow down and repeat what happened. Tom had shown up at Elena's house around midnight, drunk and pounding on her door so hard the neighbors came outside. He was screaming that Elena had ruined his whole life by talking to us, and that she was nothing but a gold-digging whore who tricked him 20 years ago. Daniel, Elena's son, grabbed his mom's phone and called 911, while Tom kept kicking their front door and throwing empty beer bottles at their windows. The cops showed up within 10 minutes and arrested Tom for drunk and disorderly conduct plus property damage, since he'd broken 2 windows and dented their door. By noon, his mugshot was on the local news website, and Sarah's phone wouldn't stop buzzing with texts from people who recognized him. 2 days later, we sat in our lawyer's office while she filed emergency motions to freeze all of Tom's assets and protect Linda's share of their property. The judge looked at the evidence of Tom's secret family, the IRS audit notice, and the police report from Elena's house, and granted a temporary order right there in the courtroom. Tom would get served the papers at his office the next day. That afternoon, Sarah met Robert's wife, Maria, at a coffee shop near our house. Maria turned out to be this warm, kind woman who hugged Sarah right away and said she'd been hoping to meet her for years. She showed Sarah pictures of her 2 sons, who were Sarah's half-brothers, and said they were excited but nervous about having a big sister. Sarah's hands shook as she looked at the photos, because these boys looked just like her at that age. Same eyes and same crooked smile. Maria said Robert had always wondered about his other daughter, but Tom had threatened him years ago to stay away. The next morning, Tom got served the court papers right in the middle of a client meeting at his office. His secretary later told Linda that everyone in the conference room saw the whole thing, the process server walking in and announcing Tom's name before handing him the thick envelope. Within an hour, Tom called Sarah's phone, screaming so loud I could hear him from the other room. He kept saying she'd destroyed his reputation and his business, and that he'd make her pay for ruining his life. Sarah was smart enough to put him on speaker, so our lawyer could hear him making threats about how he'd make sure Sarah never saw a penny of inheritance, and how he'd turn the whole family against her. Our lawyer recorded the whole call and immediately filed it with the court as evidence of harassment. 3 days later, Linda finally packed her bags and left the house she'd lived in for over 30 years. She went to stay with her sister in the next town over and filed for divorce the same day. When she called Sarah that night, her voice was small and broken, as she said she was sorry for keeping Tom's secrets for so long. She kept saying she was scared of losing everyone if the truth came out, but now she'd lost everyone anyway. Sarah told her she understood, but needed time to process everything before they could really talk. 2 months passed, and things kept getting worse for Tom. His business partners called an emergency meeting after learning about the IRS audit and the fraud allegations that Marcus had reported. They'd already lost 2 major contracts because clients didn't want to be associated with the scandal. The partners voted to force Tom to sell his shares in the company, or they'd press criminal charges for embezzlement based on irregularities they'd found in the books. Tom had 48 hours to decide, but everyone knew he didn't have a choice. During this time, Daniel came to our house and told Sarah that Tom had been calling him non-stop. Tom wanted Daniel to sign a statement saying Elena had seduced him when he was vulnerable and that she'd trapped him into the relationship. He offered Daniel $50,000 to lie and say Tom was the victim in all of this. Daniel refused and decided to go stay with his grandparents on his mom's side until things calmed down. A week later, Sarah drove past her childhood home and saw the for sale sign stuck in the front yard. Linda had to list the house to pay for her divorce lawyer and to cover half the debt from Tom's hidden spending. Sarah pulled over and just sat there looking at the house where she grew up. All those birthday parties and Christmas mornings now feeling fake. She realized strangers would soon be living there, making new memories in rooms where her whole childhood had been built on lies. The forensic accountant our lawyer hired finally finished going through Tom's finances and found something huge. Tom had been moving money to offshore accounts for the past 7 years, hiding over $2 million while telling Linda they needed to budget carefully. He'd been planning his exit for years, slowly taking money from their joint accounts and his business while keeping up his image as a successful businessman and loving father. The accountant found transfers to accounts in the Cayman Islands and evidence that Tom had been setting up a whole new identity overseas. Sarah organized a meeting at our house with Marcus, Robert, Daniel, and Sophia, who was Elena's daughter. Everyone brought copies of documents and information they'd gathered about Tom's lies and crimes. Daniel and Sophia were struggling with everything, but seemed grateful to be included instead of shut out. They all agreed to work together through the legal proceedings and to support each other as Tom's empire continued to fall apart. 2 days after our meeting, Sarah was walking through her office lobby when Tom burst through the glass doors. The receptionist jumped up from her desk, but Tom pushed past her and started yelling at Sarah in front of everyone. Tom barging into Sarah's workplace like some villain from a bad soap opera really shows his problem-solving skills at their finest. Nothing says, "I'm innocent," quite like making a scene where your daughter works. He called her a bastard child who ruined his life and said she wasn't even his real daughter, so she had no right to destroy him. Sarah's co-workers stopped what they were doing and stared as Tom kept screaming about how she was nothing but a mistake her mother made. Security guards came running from the elevator bank and grabbed Tom's arms while he kept shouting that Sarah was a lying whore, just like her real father, whoever that was. They dragged him toward the exit while he kicked and fought them, still screaming that Sarah destroyed everything he built. Her boss pulled Sarah into a conference room and told her to take some time off with pay until things calmed down. Sarah sat in her car shaking for 20 minutes before she could drive home. That afternoon, she made an appointment with a therapist her friend recommended. 3 days later, she sat in the therapist's office trying to explain everything that happened. The therapist listened carefully and then started pointing out patterns Sarah never noticed before. She explained how Tom used everyone's secrets as weapons to control them, and how he created a system where everyone was afraid to cross him. Sarah started to see how Tom had been manipulating the whole family for years, making them compete for his approval while hiding his own crimes. The therapist helped her understand that she was never the problem, and that Tom's anger came from losing control, not from anything she did wrong. Sarah left that session feeling lighter than she had in weeks. The next morning, a package arrived from Robert with copies of Sarah's birth certificate and medical records from when she was born. He included a note saying he'd been gathering proof about her real father for months. Sarah's blood type was AB negative, but Tom was O positive, and Linda was A positive, which meant Tom couldn't be her biological father. Seeing it written in black and white on official hospital documents made it real in a way that Tom's angry words hadn't. Sarah put the papers in a folder with all the other evidence they were collecting. 10 weeks after everything started falling apart, Tom's lawyer called asking for a meeting. Sarah brought her own lawyer, and they met in a conference room downtown. Tom's lawyer said his client wanted to negotiate and would admit to the affairs if Sarah stopped cooperating with the IRS investigation. Sarah's lawyer actually laughed and explained that federal investigations don't work that way, and that Sarah couldn't stop it even if she wanted to. Tom's lawyer looked defeated and said they had to try something because Tom was getting desperate. Sarah told them Tom should have thought about that before he committed tax fraud for 15 years. The meeting ended with Tom's lawyer saying they'd be in touch about the divorce proceedings. That same week, Tom's arrest for assault at Sarah's workplace became public record, and a reporter from the Columbus Dispatch started digging into the story. The headline, "Prominent Businessman's Double Life Exposed," ran on the front page of the business section with details about Tom's second family and his arrest. Tom's phone started ringing non-stop as his business contacts read the story. His reputation that he'd spent 30 years building was destroyed in one news cycle. The country club board called an emergency meeting and voted to revoke Tom's membership after multiple members complained about the scandal. His golf buddies stopped returning his calls and started avoiding him at the grocery store. Tom's brother called Sarah to say Tom was getting what he deserved and mentioned that Tom had borrowed $50,000 from him to support his other family. He said Tom told him it was for a business investment, but now he knew where the money really went. Elena saw the news story too and decided it was time to make things official. She hired a lawyer and filed for child support for Daniel and Sophia, asking the court to recognize Tom as their legal father. She had 15 years of bank statements showing regular deposits from Tom and text messages where he promised to take care of them. Tom couldn't deny these kids existed anymore since their pictures were already in the newspaper. His lawyer called it a nightmare scenario because now Tom had 3 different legal battles happening at once. Sarah decided to clean out her childhood bedroom while Linda was staying with her sister. She found a box of birthday cards Tom had given her over the years, all signed "Love Dad," with little notes about how proud he was. Reading them made her sick to her stomach, knowing he'd been lying the whole time. She threw them all in a garbage bag along with photos of Tom from family vacations. In one drawer, she found her high school graduation program where Tom was listed as the proud father. She ripped it in half and added it to the trash. The IRS Criminal Division officially opened an investigation after reviewing the evidence Sarah and Marcus provided. Federal agents showed up at Tom's house with a warrant and took his passport so he couldn't leave the country. They interviewed Sarah for 3 hours about what she knew about Tom's finances and his second family. Marcus had his own interview the next day, and Elena was scheduled for the following week. The agents said this was bigger than just hiding income and that Tom could face serious federal charges. Tom started texting his kids constantly, begging them to talk to him. 3 months after the truth came out, Jessica finally made her choice. She called Tom and told him she couldn't forgive him for destroying their mother and their family. She said all 3 of Linda's children were done with him and to stop contacting them. Tom kept texting anyway, but they all blocked his number. The next week, Tom's company held an emergency board meeting and voted him out as CEO. His assistant of 20 years called Marcus and said she'd been keeping records of Tom's weird business trips and cash withdrawals for years. She handed over 3 boxes of documents showing Tom had been using company credit cards for both families. Linda's lawyer found something even worse when going through their financial papers. Tom had taken out $1-million life insurance policies on both Linda and Elena without telling them. He'd named himself as the only person who'd get the money if they died. Both women filed police reports that same day. Then Elena dropped the biggest bomb yet. She showed up at Sarah's work crying and told her she was 3 months pregnant. Tom had known for weeks and kept pushing her to get rid of the baby. When she refused, he started getting more and more angry, and that's when everything started falling apart. This would be Tom's 6th kid between both families. That night, Sarah broke down in our bedroom. She said she wanted kids someday, but was scared she'd mess them up like her dad did. I held her and reminded her she was already breaking the cycle by choosing truth over lies. She wasn't anything like Tom, and our kids would know what real love looked like. 2 days later, we got a call at 3 in the morning. Tom had taken a bunch of pills, but then called 911 himself. The hospital put him on a psych hold. Linda felt guilty, even though she shouldn't have. Sarah just felt tired and empty. The psychiatrist called Sarah since Tom had listed her as his emergency contact. The doctor said Tom showed signs of narcissistic personality disorder and needed long-term treatment. Sarah told them she wasn't taking responsibility for his care and hung up. While Tom was in the hospital, things got even worse for him legally. The FBI got involved because Tom's hidden money had crossed state lines and involved wire fraud. His lawyer told him he was looking at decades in federal prison and should make a deal. Meanwhile, Daniel and Sophia asked to meet their half-siblings for dinner. We all went to a quiet restaurant, and it was awkward at first. But Sophia said even though it hurt, she was glad the truth truth was finally out. They were all victims of Tom's lies, and maybe they could support each other. Sarah decided to visit Tom's elderly mother to try to understand how he became this way. His mom lived in a small house 2 hours away. She told Sarah that Tom's father had been exactly the same. Multiple families, stealing money, hurting everyone around him. She said she knew about it all but stayed quiet because that's what men in their family did. She'd enabled Tom his whole life because she thought that's just how things were. The cycle had been going on for generations. 4 months after everything came out, Tom got released from the psychiatric hold. That same night at 2 in the morning, we woke up to pounding on our front door. Tom was drunk and screaming threats at us. I called 911 while Sarah hid in the bathroom. The cops arrested him for violating the restraining order, and this time the judge held him without bail. 2 weeks later, his lawyer called Sarah to tell her the federal prosecutor was offering Tom a deal. 5 to 7 years if he cooperated and gave them everything about his financial crimes. 15 to 20 if he went to trial and lost. The lawyer practically begged Sarah to convince Tom to take it, since she was the only one he'd still talk to through the jail phone. Sarah went to see him, and he sat there behind the glass looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. She told him about the deal, and he just shook his head. He kept saying he could explain everything to a jury, and they'd understand. The lawyer looked ready to cry when Sarah told him Tom's answer. That same week, Marcus called us with news that made my stomach drop. He'd been going through Tom's computer files and found emails to a woman in Indiana. Not just any woman, but another one Tom had been seeing for over 10 years. Marcus forwarded us photos from her social media, and there was Tom at birthday parties and holidays with this woman and her kid. The investigation expanded immediately, and everyone started wondering just how many families Tom actually had. Tom's claiming Sarah isn't his real daughter, while the hospital records prove exactly that. I'm curious why he chose this specific attack when he knew the truth would come out. Sarah couldn't sleep for 3 days after that. She kept going through old photos trying to spot signs she'd missed. Then she got a call from Elena who said all of Tom's kids should meet. Sarah was scared at first, but agreed. They met at a coffee shop downtown, and it turned into something none of them expected. There was Sarah and her brother, Daniel and Sophia from Elena's side, and now this new kid from Indiana whose mom was flying in for the trial. They sat there for 4 hours sharing stories and realized Tom had used the exact same manipulation tactics on all of them. He'd tell each family the others were crazy or dangerous. He'd use the same phrases and promises with each woman. He'd even given the same gifts to different kids on their birthdays. They started meeting every week after that, and it actually helped Sarah more than any therapy had. November came, and Robert invited Sarah to his family's Thanksgiving. She almost said no because holidays had always been Tom's big production where he'd control everything. But she went, and it was nothing like what she was used to. Nobody was performing or keeping secrets or walking on eggshells. Robert's dad told bad jokes, and his mom burned the rolls, and everyone just laughed about it. Sarah sat at that table and started crying because for the first time in her life, she was at a family dinner where nobody was lying. 5 months after everything first came out, Tom's trial finally started. The courthouse was packed with reporters since the story had gone viral online. Sarah testified first and had to describe 20 years of lies and manipulation. Linda went next and explained how Tom had hidden money in accounts under their kids' names without telling her. Elena took the stand and talked about how Tom had promised to leave Linda for 15 years while secretly taking trips with both families. Every woman who testified painted the same picture of a man who built elaborate lies to control everyone around him. Then Daniel got up there, and that's when things got really bad for Tom. This 17-year-old kid described how his dad had trained him and his sister to lie about their family situation. Tom had made them practice stories about why Linda wasn't around and coached them on what to say if anyone asked questions. Daniel's voice broke when he talked about the guilt he felt for lying to Sarah when she'd been nothing but kind to them. Several jurors were wiping their eyes by the time he finished. Tom's lawyer tried to limit the damage, but Tom insisted on testifying against all advice. He got up there in his expensive suit trying to look sympathetic. He claimed he was just trying to take care of everyone and that he never meant to hurt anyone. The prosecutor calmly pulled out document after document showing Tom's calculated deceptions. Bank records proving he'd stolen money from Linda's parents. Emails where he'd planned elaborate lies to tell each family. Text messages where he'd laughed about how gullible Sarah was. The prosecutor asked him about each piece of evidence, and Tom kept trying to explain them away, but his story kept changing. Then, during cross-examination, Tom finally snapped. The prosecutor asked him why he'd tried to break up Sarah's marriage if he cared so much about family. Tom jumped up and screamed that Sarah had ruined everything out of spite. The judge banged his gavel and threatened to hold Tom in contempt. Tom's face turned red, and he kept yelling about how ungrateful everyone was after all he'd done for them. His mask had finally fallen completely, and everyone could see the angry, controlling man he'd always been underneath. The prosecutor smiled and said he had one more witness. The courtroom doors opened, and a woman appeared on the video screen. She was calling in from Indiana, and nobody had known she was going to testify. Even Tom's lawyer looked shocked because this wasn't in any of the discovery documents. The woman introduced herself as Patricia and said she'd been with Tom for 10 years. Then she said the words that made the whole courtroom gasp. She had a 10-year-old son, and Tom was the father. Tom's face went white, and he started shaking his head, but Patricia had the paternity test and years of photos. She'd found out about the trial online and contacted the prosecutor herself. Tom had told her he was a traveling salesman who could only visit once a month. She'd believed him for a decade until she saw his picture in the news. The jury left to deliberate and came back in just 3 hours, guilty on all counts, including wire fraud and tax evasion and identity theft and conspiracy. The judge read each verdict, and Tom stared straight at Sarah the whole time. She didn't look away this time, and I saw her shoulders finally relax when the last guilty was read. 2 months later, we were back in the same courtroom for sentencing. Tom wore an orange jumpsuit this time, and his lawyer kept whispering in his ear, but Tom just stared at Sarah the whole time. The judge read through the victim impact statements from Elena and her kids, and from all the people he'd scammed with his fake investments. When it was time for the sentence, the judge called Tom a master manipulator who destroyed multiple families for his own ego and gave him 12 years federal prison plus restitution to all his victims. The bailiffs cuffed him and led him away, and he finally looked away from Sarah to glare at me one last time. Linda's divorce went through the next week, and she got the house, though she told us she was selling it right away, plus half of whatever legitimate assets were left after the government took their share. She started seeing a therapist twice a week to figure out how she'd let Tom control her for so long and never questioned all his lies. Elena had her baby a month after that and named her Hope, which made me think about how this kid would never know Tom at all. Elena told us they were moving to Texas to be near her family and start fresh with the settlement money from the fraud case. Daniel got into a good school down there, and Sophia was excited about having cousins to play with for the first time. Sarah went to the courthouse one morning and filed paperwork to change her last name to Robert's surname, which was Smith. She said it felt right choosing the father who would have loved her over the one who raised her but never really did. The clerk asked if it was for marriage, and Sarah just said no, it was for family. Almost a year after everything came out, Marcus got married, and the whole extended family came together for the first time since the truth exploded. Tom's siblings pulled Sarah aside at the reception and apologized for taking his side at first and said they should have seen the signs. The family felt smaller without Tom and Linda's whole side, but it also felt healthier, like a wound that finally stopped being infected. At the reception, Sarah and I stood up during toasts and announced we were expecting our first baby. Linda started crying happy tears and said this grandchild would grow up knowing only truth and love. Robert and Maria came over and offered to be extra grandparents since this baby would need all the love they could get. 3 months into the pregnancy, a letter came from the federal prison where Tom was locked up. Sarah looked at the return address and didn't even open it, just called Marcus and asked him to come over. They went through the house, gathering every photo with Tom in it and all his letters from over the years and even his old golf trophies from the garage. We built a fire in the backyard fire pit, and they took turns throwing everything in, watching his face curl up and turn to ash. Sarah kept one photo, though the one of her as a baby with Robert, before Tom came into the picture. One afternoon, Sarah asked me to drive her somewhere and directed me to the restaurant where I'd first seen Tom with Elena all those years ago. We sat in the parking lot, and she stared at the entrance for a long time, then said, if I hadn't kept that secret, none of the truth would have come out. She said sometimes the right choice isn't clear until way later, and she was glad I'd waited, even though it hurt at the time. She started writing about everything online, making a blog about surviving narcissistic abuse and family betrayal. Within a week, she had hundreds of messages from people with similar stories about parents who lied and manipulated and controlled. She realized Tom wasn't special or unique, just another manipulator who finally faced consequences, which most of them never do. Now I'm sitting in our nursery, helping Sarah put together the crib we bought yesterday. She's 8 months pregnant and talking to her belly, telling the baby they'll never have to question who they are or where they belong. She's promising this kid will know every part of their story from day one and never have to discover terrible secrets when they're grown. The mobile above the crib has little elephants on it because Sarah says elephants never forget, and neither will we. This whole mess started because Tom tried to break us apart, but instead he broke apart his entire web of lies. Our kid will grow up surrounded by people who chose truth over comfort and love over blood. The cycle of lies ends here with us, in this little yellow nursery, with elephant decorations and a crib that took 3 hours to build because I kept putting the rails on backwards. Thanks for letting me be your clever companion through all this. It's been a blast. Until our paths cross again in another story adventure, like the video, it helps more than you think.